Hi, I'm Cardiff Garcia, and this is The New Bazaar. Coming up on today's show.
Turns out there are a lot of free lunches in the criminal justice system, right? There are misaligned incentives all the time. We're just making big mistakes all over the place, where if we just followed the data a little bit better, we could have less crime for less money.
Jennifer Doleac on the economics of crime and the science of second chances. Hey everyone, Cardiff here. Today's episode is going to be really special. Jen Doleac is an economist who studies crime, and she's got this great new book coming out in February called The Science of Second Chances, A Revolution in Criminal Justice. Please go pre-order it right now. It's fantastic before you even listen to the rest of this conversation. Trust me, you're going to be happy that you did. This book looks at the evidence behind ways to give people who have been arrested for or convicted of a crime a second chance at life, a way of starting over and finding a way to reduce the likelihood that they'll commit a crime again, and also just have better outcomes in life, getting jobs, having happy families, things of that nature. And the book looks at studies that try to answer questions like, how long should prison sentences be? How should probation be structured? For people who do end up going to prison, what kinds of incentives should we give them for how they spend their time there and how they rehabilitate themselves? How should we take into account variables like age or mental health? And what happens when somebody gets out of prison? What are the best policies to put them on the path to success? And then finally, when we do have solutions to these kinds of problems, what is stopping policymakers from implementing them? To answer these questions, Jen's done a ton of this kind of research herself, and she also has a super detailed knowledge of the work of other economists and other scholars in the field, which means that she's about as well placed to evaluate all that work as anybody I know. And as you're going to see in this chat, an economic approach to these questions is incredibly valuable. Some ideas that seem good, seem like just common sense, end up not actually working very well when you go through the data. And then other ideas that seem backwards or even unfair, things that might make you feel a little uneasy, end up having huge societal benefits. And this work is not just about how to use limited government resources and money in the best possible way, although that's great. It's not even just about what benefits societally generally, making the world a better and a safer place, though clearly that's also great. It's about finding smart ways to help people get their lives back on track so that an early mistake doesn't end up defining everything that comes after, with consequences not just for them, but for their family, their friends, and their loved ones. The Science of Second Chances is going to be a really important book, and I'm so excited to have this chat with Jen Doleac, the author. Here it is. Jen, hello. We've got our podcast voices on now.
We do.
Right. But you and I have spoken many times. Right. I've interviewed you many times about your work. Mm-hmm. Now that this book is out, which seems like a compilation of so much of the work you've done previously, are you more nervous or excited for it to be out in the world, given that criminal studies is kind of a rough and tumble area of scholarship, isn't it?
It is. It turns out I have studied other more controversial things. Crime is on lower on the list. So it's actually this is fun.
What is it below? What have you studied that it's below? I'm just out of curiosity.
Opioids and public health actually are that's the roughest and tumbliest.
Because you've got, in the case of crime, you've got economists, you've got sociologists, you've got scholars of, I think criminal studies is its own path you can take. Mm-hmm. What have you learned about how your findings and how your sort of assessment of others' findings, what have you learned about how that gets absorbed in the rest of the field, in the rest of not just economics of crime, but in other fields that study crime?
Yeah, I think most people are surprised that an economist would ever think about this topic. I meet someone for the first time and I say I'm an economist and I study crime and criminal justice policy. They immediately think, okay, she must mean white collar crime.
Or just Madoff or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. And it's like, no, homicide, actual real crimes or crimes that you see on TV, not that white collar crime isn't real crime. But I think what economists are bringing to the table is really an obsession with distinguishing correlation from causation. And that's probably the source of most disagreement and upset in the field when there is some across scholars from
Correlation
different
versus
fields.
causation. Like you introduce a new policy and you see these outcomes and you're like, oh, that policy caused those outcomes. And sometimes, well, not necessarily. Might have been something else, that kind of thing.
Right. I think where this comes up most often is people who are looking to see if a reentry program is effective or if a program that is in prison is effective. You look at the people who participated in the program or who completed the program and compare them to people who didn't. And it turns out almost always the people who completed the program do better later on than people who did not participate in the program. And my main concern with studies like that is usually people have volunteered for the program or were carefully selected. A lot of reentry programs are very careful to heavily screen applicants based on how much they seem to want to change and only take the people who are most motivated. And it's like, all right, well, if you're comparing motivated people to unmotivated people, then maybe we're not surprised that they do better later.
It's not the program that necessarily
It's not the program
helped.
itself, right.
It was the fact that people who already were inclined to improve, to change their trajectory in life, they ended up doing so, but they might have been able to do that anyways.
Right.
It wasn't the program. They selected themselves into the program.
Exactly. So what we really want to know is what was the value add of that program? That's the big policy question, right? When we think about how should we be investing our public safety resources, our tax dollars in general, we want to be investing in things that are actually going to move the needle, change the trajectory that somebody's on. And so those correlational studies are not giving us that. So the three things I think economists are bringing to the table are first, this obsession with causal inference, that's distinguishing correlation from causation. But then the other two places are economists think a lot about how people respond to incentives. Mm-hmm. And so that's really the theoretical lens we're bringing to the table and this assumption that all the decisions we make, all of us, all day long are really, we're doing a complex calculus problem in our heads and trying to weigh the costs and benefits of things. And so changing the incentives we're facing and the factors we're considering will change the behavior. And that's just a very different way of thinking about human behavior than, say, what a sociologist would predict or a political scientist would predict. And then there's this other piece about how should we spend our money? Where's the best use of a marginal dollar? Do we put it toward prison? Do we put it toward police? Do we put it toward schools if our goal is to reduce crime? And that's the sort of thing that economists love to think about.
Yeah. Do you think we've suitably upset all the other scholars
Absolutely.
of crime by
yeah.
now?
I mean, we could probably do more.
Start talking now about what's actually in your book. So before we started this chat, just to give the audience a little behind the scenes here, I was telling you that there's so many studies in the book that we can't go through how every single study was designed because then we'd never actually get into what the studies actually found. So I just asked you to pick maybe your single favorite, most emblematic study for how this actually goes in, researching these ideas, right? Like what is your single favorite, whether it's one of yours or one that you cite in the book? Give us one study, take us through it, take us through how it's designed and how it shares familiar features with a lot of the other studies that you look at. Because a lot of them are similar. They study different things, but the studies themselves are similar.
Yeah, it turns out in practice, there are only a few research designs here that are commonly used in this kind of space. So, and the key here is that we want to approximate as best we can the randomized controlled trial that you might see in a laboratory. So that's sort of when we've got our researcher hats on, that's what we're hunting for, is something in the real world that will get us as close to that treatment and control group as possible. So we're looking for something that introduces randomness into the process so that people aren't choosing to sign up for a program or being carefully selected based on motivation or something like that. So one of the study designs that's really popular in this space is thinking about the randomization of different cases to different decision makers. So for instance, we talk a lot about how, if we're thinking about what the impact of prison is on people's outcomes after their conviction and punishment.
The likelihood that they'll commit crime again, for example.
Right.
Yeah.
We can't randomize people to prison or not, right? That would be certainly illegal, probably unethical. A lot of people would be really uncomfortable with that. But it turns out that in practice, we do randomize cases to different judges or cases to different prosecutors. And those individual decision makers, because they're human, differ in what their best judgment is about what should happen to this person. So we wind up in practice because we've got randomization to different decision makers who will naturally make different decisions, you have essentially randomization to the different treatments.
So for example, if you have two different prosecutors,
Mm-hmm.
one just by nature might be more likely to pursue aggressive charges and try to get somebody put in prison. Another prosecutor might be a little more lenient and just by nature, might be more likely to say, you know what,
Mhm.
we're not even going to charge this person. We're going to let them go, and I'm going to focus on the tougher cases or something like that.
Right. So I have this study with Amanda Egan and Anna Harvey where we look at this kind of randomization, a practice that essentially gives cases to different prosecutors as if at random in Suffolk County, Massachusetts, where Boston is, to be able to study what the impact of that prosecution decision is. So do you drop the case or do you pursue it? And prosecutors are doing this all day long. They have to do it really fast. They only have a couple minutes per case. There are so many, especially what we were looking at was nonviolent misdemeanor cases. There are a zillion of these that have to go through the court every day. They have to move fast. And as you said, sometimes someone's just a little bit more lenient. Someone's a little bit harsher. They've seen some of these cases before and they just don't like, drug offenders versus not. And so just by the luck of the draw, you as a defendant, you happen to get a lenient prosecutor, that means that you are now less likely to have your case pulled forward. You're more likely to have your case just dropped in that initial arraignment hearing versus if you happen to be there the next day instead and gotten a different prosecutor, that prosecutor would have pursued your case. And so basically that sets up a nice natural experiment where because the cases are randomly assigned to different prosecutors, that luck of the draw determines the likelihood that your case is pursued or not. And so that gives us really that experiment that we were looking for. It's as if we flipped a coin to see if we pursue your case or not, but in a way that actually happens in real courtrooms every day. So in that study, we were able then to see, okay, what's the impact of having your case dismissed in that initial arraignment hearing versus carried forward? And in practice, what we wound up finding was that it turns out if you get lucky, you get the lenient prosecutor, your case is dismissed, you are much less likely to reoffend in the future, which was a big surprise to me as a researcher.
Why was it surprising?
I am used to everything having trade-offs. Everything's going to have costs and benefits. And the question is just how much, right? Like how big is the cost versus how big is the benefit? And in this case, I figured, if you don't pursue the case, just mechanically, some of those people are now not going to be maybe in jail, not going to be on probation. And so they're going to go out and get into more trouble. And the real question in my mind was, well, how big is that cost going to be relative to how much time it would save everybody if we just dismissed some of these really low-level cases up front? And then it turned out it was just, there weren't costs and benefits that were weighed against each other. It was all benefits.
Just benefits, right?
Only benefits. Like economists always say there's no such thing as a free lunch, right?
You found one. You found the free lunch.
Turns out there are a lot of free lunches in the criminal justice system, right? There are misaligned incentives all the time. We're just making big mistakes all over the place where if we just followed the data a little bit better, we could have less crime for less money. And those are big opportunities we should find.
Yeah. I was also surprised by this because you had set up that part of the book as there's always a trade-off. And specifically, for example, you were looking at the effects of having a DNA database where you essentially take the swab of a first-time offender, somebody who commits a crime for the first time or is arrested for the first time. You take a swab, now their DNA is in a database somewhere. And you find that it is actually beneficial to have this database for preventing future crime on behalf of the same person, right? So that person's going to be less likely to commit a crime if they know that their DNA is somewhere because the likelihood that they'll actually get caught is higher. But you went through a whole list of possible trade-offs, and there were some there.
Yep. Right. And probably most cases there are trade-offs, right? Maybe it costs us a little bit more money, but we get lower crime as a result. And so, okay, we just have to think about, is it worth it?
People who don't like, the intrusion of privacy or surveillance technology, things like that. Like these are really big societal questions, but there are clear benefits and clear trade-offs. In the case of this chapter you have, it's literally titled Err Towards Leniency. So in the case of prosecutors deciding for a first-time misdemeanor person, right, let them go the first time, okay, and see what happens. And it turns out that they are less likely to commit a crime in the future than if they are prosecuted. That's fascinating to me because it seems like there really are no trade-offs. But there's a wrinkle in this too, which is that there still were costs on behalf of the person who committed the crime or allegedly committed the crime, the person who got arrested, to get to that stage. And those things matter, right? Like being arrested and all that. If you take all that away, because people might hear this and say, Well, just don't enforce the law. just don't enforce misdemeanors. Yeah, decriminalize. Mm-hmm. That is not your conclusion. Give us a sense of the nuances there.
Yeah, we heard that a lot when the study first came out. My colleagues and I were, doing lots of interviews and hearing from lots of advocates saying, "Great, we're so glad the study has proven that we should just decriminalize all nonviolent misdemeanors. It's not worth it to arrest and punish anybody for trespassing, shoplifting, drug possession." And we were very quick to say that is not what the study shows, right? Not having your case pursued, having your case dismissed at the first arraignment hearing is not the same as no consequences. You were arrested, you were probably booked in jail, you had to miss work for this court date, you're probably really stressed out about it, especially for these first-time offenders who are the ones where we found all the benefits, right? So it really is like giving those folks who don't have a criminal record yet a second chance to avoid a first record. If this is your first run-in with the system, for a lot of people, this is going to be their rock bottom moment. That's maybe a wake-up call to say, whoa, I need to stop hanging out with that guy I'm always getting drunk with, or stop, whatever it is, I need to clean up my act. And it just turns out that in a lot of those cases, if we just get out of their way, they will course correct on their own. Not everyone will, but a lot of people will. And then that helps us kind of triage a little bit, and we can focus then on the smaller group that remains and do something different for them.
Yeah. One question I had, and I'm certain this is something that economists and that you in particular think about all the time, is when you have a finding like this as part of this randomized experiment, or just the randomized nature of how it worked in the real world, is if you change something, will this finding necessarily scale? Mm-hmm. So if, for example, that prosecutors, as a matter of policy, are not going to charge you your first time you do something, or if it's a misdemeanor, nonviolent misdemeanor, well, that sounds great. Now I'll just go out there and it's time to go to the mall and start sticking stuff in my pockets, right? Totally. That sounds great.
Yeah.
And so this finding is interesting, but it only works in the context of how the system is shaped now. If you reshape the system, will it still hold? How should we think about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you can easily see how a policy of everyone gets one free shoplifting charge would be very bad, right? That is clearly going to lead to more shoplifting. I think the way this is implemented in practice, and the actual policy change that the DA in Suffolk County implemented, that we were also in that paper able to study, which was very useful, established a presumption of non-prosecution. Not a blanket policy that we do not prosecute these cases, but a presumption. So really just changing the default from we're always going to prosecute these cases to we probably won't. And then it still is going to vary across individual prosecutors and individual cases, and kind of depending on the specific case, a good reason to go ahead and prosecute someone might be that they've cycled through the system a few times, or they seem to show no remorse, or a variety of other things I'm sure we could all imagine. But it really is kind of changing. It turns out in prosecutors' offices in general, because there's so many of these cases, prosecutors drop these low-level cases all the time. So if we're talking about going from dropping 30% of the cases to dropping 50% of the cases, not from 0 to 100. So it really is kind of this marginal shift. But it was nice that in Suffolk County, where there was actually this policy change, that we were able to go in and say, okay, maybe in the courtroom, the individual defendant kind of knew they got lucky, right? They got the lenient DA and they got their case dismissed, and they'd been sitting there all day and they saw everybody, being convicted. And so they're like, ooh, I dodged a bullet there. I better change. But if it's an actual policy, then maybe they don't.
You got to be careful.
Right. You got to be careful. And so being able to kind of go from these proof of concept kind of, almost pilots, try it somewhere once, do the first study. We found that effect. And then it's like, okay, well then the question is, what's the actual policy we are suggesting that prosecutors implement? And of course, we got that question all the time after the study. What exactly is the line? Exactly which cases should we be dropping? And then we, had to give the very unsatisfying answer a lot. Well, we don't quite know, but we'd love to help you learn, right? In different contexts, basically where you're drawing the line. It might be easy, imagine what a slightly different policy or slightly different guidance to your staff might be, and let's implement that and let's see what happens. And that's basically the only way we're going to learn.
You can tell I'm old, by the way, because I made a reference to going to the mall and stealing things, right? That's the most teenager. The most teenager in the 1990s thing I've ever heard.
Everyone just Googles mall.
Right. Well, what is that? Some 28-year-old right now listening to this is super confused.
Mm-hmm.
Does this also apply for either more violent crimes or for felonies?
Yes. So there's another study that looks at the effect of, again, erring toward leniency, which means something a little different with more serious cases, but for nonviolent felony cases. So the only studies we have right now are looking at nonviolent types of crimes. We need some studies on the violent cases, but we could look at felonies, which are cases or types of crimes that are usually punishable by a year or more in prison. So more serious offenses, things like burglary, larceny. And there's a cool study in Harris County, Texas, where Houston is located, my current home.
Where you live?
Yes. And they looked at some cool policy changes that introduced some sudden shocks to the likelihood that someone who was charged with a nonviolent felony would get what's called a deferred adjudication, which means that if you go through a probationary period, you don't do anything else wrong, you clean up your act, then the charge is dropped and you avoid having that felony record. And they found something very similar, that for people who got lucky and wound up getting a deferred adjudication because of this policy change, they were dramatically less likely to reoffend. And again, as in the Suffolk County example, they found that this effect was really driven by these first-time offenders. So it was helping them avoid that first criminal record that had so much value. And they were also able to link to stuff like employment and earnings and show that people earned a lot more. Like they got jobs.
Yeah, it wasn't just about reducing.
Wasn't just the
committing crime in the future. Yeah, that's great.
Right. So yeah, all of this together, I think this area is an example of a place where the research has really changed my prior about how this works. I mean, it just seems, you hear about it, the idea, and you're just like, that's too good to be true. There's no way that's going to work. And then you have these studies, and it's like one after another, finding these big drops in recidivism on the order of like 50%, right? We're not talking like little things on them. It's like, you're half as likely to come
Massive
back with a reoffending. And most of our reentry programs struggle to find any impact on recidivism. So the fact that just helping people avoid that first record has such a big impact is really striking to me. And just, it feels like one place I wish we could move a little faster on the policy side.
This is one, though, where anecdotes can be very powerful and can, in some sense, overwhelm the data, because if a policymaker hears, hey, this is great, but also I heard about this one really high-profile case of somebody who reoffended and did something horrible after they were let go. Politically, that's tough. You have
Very
to sell
hard.
that to people, and meanwhile, people are saying, yeah, but look at what this person did, right? Like you let them go, and then they burned down a church or whatever, or they burned down a house or whatever. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so, like, I don't want to say I'm despairing of people like taking the data and implementing it, and implementing a policy that's consistent with it. But that's one where, like, especially now we're in this attention economy and everything like that, things get around. It seems like you have an uphill battle of convincing people on something like this.
Totally. So I now work more on the policy side. I'm a researcher by training, but now work at Arnold Ventures, which is a philanthropy that does a lot of policy work. And this is the big challenge, right? Like this is the problem. We have all these great evidence-based solutions that we want to help lawmakers scale. And they're like, yeah, but what about this case? Or even just thinking about individual judges or parole officers. They know if they let this person go and they go out and do something bad, it's their face that's going to be on the news, the judge, the probation officer. People are going to point at them and say, why didn't you know? And the reality is we can't prevent all crime unless we're really just locking everyone up. If we really wanted to, I think the best example of this is, the group that's at highest risk of committing crime is young men. The best way to, dramatically reduce crime, if we're not thinking about costs and benefits, would just be lock all the young men up until they turn 25, right? There's a reason we're not doing that. Like that would be extremely costly to civil liberties, to, just there are a variety of reasons that would be a terrible idea.
Less podcasting competition. So, I'm not totally out on it, but yeah, probably unfair.
True. And so, we live in a society where we value people having their freedom unless they're proven guilty and have a good reason to be behind bars. And so we're just sort of always making these trade-offs. But I think recognizing this sort of personal incentive, whether it's the politician, whether it's the judge, whether it's the parole officer, making decisions about, whether we want to err toward leniency, let somebody out, they have their own personal incentive that they are responding to, and that one really terrible incident that winds up on the news could end their own career. And so that pushes us really across the board toward being harsher than would be optimal from a public safety perspective.
I'm fascinated by the chapter on probation specifically, because you mentioned a second ago probation in the context of somebody who got caught doing something, at least allegedly, but they can do this non-adjudication thing where if they comply with the terms of the probation, they just don't get charged. It's over. Like they get it. But there's different kinds of probation, right? There's probation for people who did get convicted. And if they do probation, they can avoid prison, things like that. Like there's different ways to design it. And you have a whole chapter on this. Here's a stat, by the way, that I didn't know. Okay. In the country, there's 3 million people on probation. There's 1.7 million people incarcerated. There's almost double. There's almost twice as many people who are on probation as people who are actually in jail or in prison. And you write that almost 30% of people on probation ultimately fail to follow the requirements and end up back in prison, or they get penalized some other way for that.
Yeah.
What's going on there? I mean, before we can even figure out how to do it better, what's happening there? What is it about probation that make it so hard to follow the terms?
Yeah.
Not all of this is just people, okay, they're criminals, so they can't follow probation. That's not the case. Like there's something about the way it's designed that's frustrating people.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the idea here, the way it should work, you're released on probation, on community supervision. You've got a probation officer you have to check in with on a regular basis and a whole bunch of rules to comply with. Maybe you have a curfew. You have to be home by a certain time of night. You aren't supposed to hang out with other people who have felony records. You're not supposed to use drugs or alcohol.
Can't leave the jurisdiction or
can't
something
leave,
like that.
Can't leave the county, things like that without permission and all these things. You have to find a job. So all of these things are really set up ideally as guideposts to kind of help you clean up your act, do things that are going to keep you out of trouble, avoid things that are likely to put you in high risk situations. And that all sounds great. And then you can't comply with those kinds of rules, the idea is that should be a flag, that's a signal to the court that this isn't going very well and you're likely to commit another crime. So in theory, the rules should be things that are actually predictive of committing new offenses. But then there are just so many stories out there of people who are like, yeah, but I have to, leave work to take a bus all the way across the city to meet with my probation officer at 1 p.m. and then I lose my job and I can't. And I opened with a story in this chapter about a woman who had been pulled over for a DUI, got one of these, was on a probationary term, and she wasn't allowed to move into a different apartment. And then there was a mouse infestation in her house and she had to move, and then it just got caught up. She
wasn't allowed to move. Yeah, she needed permission from the judge to move or whatever.
You read about it and it's like, this is insane. There's no way this is actually helping them create a structure or giving them a structure for a better, more law-abiding life. This is just a bunch of hoops you have to jump through that don't really make any sense. And so there's just a ton of stories out there like that. And then it just becomes a question of okay, lots of bad anecdotes, but I understand the theory. I understand why we want some rules. And we did have a system a long time ago, the 70s and earlier, where if you're on probation, basically just send a postcard once a month to your probation officer. That most people probably want more structure than that too. So it's okay, how is this actually working in practice? And are the rules that we're giving people actually helping them build a life that is the life we want them building?
Isn't the answer no?
The answer is
in the actual studies, it seems not. By the way, as you were going through some of the rules in a couple of these cases, I was sitting there thinking totally outside the criminal justice system. I would have trouble complying with all this stuff.
Right.
I would, you know what I mean?
Much less if you, maybe don't have a car, it's especially if you're in these situations where, it takes a lot of time to get around or something, and you have much less control over various aspects of your life. Fulfilling a lot of these requirements, it's just really hard.
Yeah, the finding specifically was that more tough supervisory requirements does not lead to better outcomes for these people.
And it's remarkable. This is an area where, across the criminal justice system, one of the fun parts about this area to research for me as an economist was always, it's really hard to randomize things in this space, right? You can't randomly send people to prison and whatever. So you have to find really clever natural experiments, the stuff we were talking about before. And this is an area that people have actually run RCTs on whether people should be on more intense or less intense supervision. They actually randomize people to high intensity supervision, medium, or low, which just seems crazy. How did they pull this off across all these different places? So maybe that's just their nerdy economist in me that finds that the most interesting piece of this whole conversation. But that means we have a bunch of RCTs in this space, and just one study after another shows more intensive supervision produces zero public safety benefit. People rack up a bunch of technical violations because once you have more rules, you're more likely to break some rules. The problem with these technical violations is that they're likely to send you back to prison or to prison in the first place if you were just going on probation. And so it costs a lot of money, right? It's a hassle for the people on probation themselves, costs money for the probation officer to supervise you. And then if you break a rule, you go to prison and now we're paying to incarcerate this person. So there are a ton of costs, and it's like, okay, but if it makes us safer, there are benefits. It does not make us safer. Just one study after another shows zero public safety benefits to go along with these costs. So in general, right now, all of these studies are just saying, do less, do less. Like whatever it is we're doing is not productive.
There was one interesting exception to that you note, which is people who struggle with substance abuse. And there you find that a specific kind of supervision is very helpful, right?
Yeah.
People who have to check in constantly to make sure that they haven't gotten drunk or used drugs again that day. That for them, if they know for sure what the terms are of the supervision, and it's, I forget the acronym, it was like SWIFT, clear, and
Swift, certain, and fair.
Swift, certain, and
Yes.
fair, you know? And there's this great anecdote in there that you cite from another scholar, the late Mark Kleiman, I think, where he said,
Yes.
you know, the way these things are set up now is that you never know if the terms of supervision are going to actually be enforced. And then it's almost like a kid whose parents tell the kid, hey, don't steal cookies out of the cookie jar. And the kid starts stealing out of the cookie jar. But they let him get away with it for, you know, every time until one day they suddenly say, hey, by the way, you're grounded for 5 years. And it's like, wait, what? Like,
right.
like, you know what I mean? Like this is one where, because people who struggle with these substances tend to be very present-minded, present-oriented, they're not thinking distantly into the future.
Yep.
It helps to be a little bit more on top of them, but to give them very clear guidance. If you break this, yes, you might go back to jail, but also we're here to help you out. So just check in with us constantly and we'll see how it goes.
Right. One of the big themes that comes up in lots of spaces across the crime and criminal justice policy literature is that what matters most for deterring crime and changing behavior is increasing the probability that people get caught quickly. It's not the severity of the consequence. And so, you know, in general, that's basically the opposite of what we do now. We have, you know, very low likelihood that you're going to get caught if you commit a crime, but then we send you to prison for a really long time on the, you know, for the rare people who do get caught. And so this is an example of you've got a bunch of probation conditions, and in practice, you know, for instance, the rule that you're not supposed to hang out with other people with felony records, how on earth are we going to enforce that? We're going to like follow you around and like check the background of all your friends, right? Like, no, of course not. Like that's just completely impractical to enforce in any kind of consistent way. But the thing about drug and alcohol use that is often banned for probationers, especially those who have a history of that problem, that's something we can check. And there are easy drug and alcohol tests that we can require people to take. And so there are these programs that require people to come into the jail once or twice a day, blow into a breathalyzer. And if you have been drinking, you immediately are in jail for the night. And if you're not, you go on your way, go to work, you know, come back tomorrow. And it turns out that something like 99% of people who come in and take these tests are sober. Like they stop drinking. And some don't. Some have a real problem and need to get treatment. And then we can kind of triage and help those people differently. But it turns out that just the shift in the incentives, as you said, because people are more present-minded, they're just not thinking that far ahead. It's all about finding a way to increase the probability of getting caught rather than focusing on increasing the punishment. And perhaps this is more salient for people who have a drug and alcohol problem. Maybe they're more present-minded than most. I mean, it's kind of true of all of us. All of us are more present-minded.
Totally.
You know, we all weight the present a little bit more than we do the future. And it turns out there are a lot of studies that look at people who are just in prison in general, people with criminal records in general, do discount the future more than the average person. So in general, the people whose behavior we're trying to change are especially not thinking about the long term. So the more we can find ways to move up the benefits of behaving well to the short term, the better off we're all going to be.
The marginally higher present-mindedness of people who tend towards crime, I'm guessing that's also related to something else you note throughout the book, which is that crime tends to be a young person's game.
Yes.
Young people are just way disproportionately more likely to commit crime. And that's also one reason why long prison sentences don't often make sense.
Right.
That it's more helpful to make sure that people know that there's a higher likelihood that they'll get caught and serve some time than it is to just put them in jail for a very long time, because some people actually age out of their doing crime
A lot of people do. A lot of people do a lot of dumb, reckless stuff when they're 16, 17, 18. And then by the time they're 40, they're married with kids and a job, right? And I think we probably all have friends we could think of who grew up a lot.
Or somebody, I'm in my 40s now. I'm like, I'm way more tired than I used to be. You know, it's like, I don't want to do forget about crime, leaving aside the issue of crime in the book and everything. It's like, I don't have the impetus to like go out there and start, causing trouble. I'd rather read a book. I'd rather read Science of Second Chances, on my couch.
I'm in bed by 8, so I can't commit crime anymore. And maybe this is a hypothesis I haven't seen people test. Is it like actually an impulse problem, or just we're more tired?
I feel like it. Right.
I love it. Yeah.
So this is interesting because in the very next part of the book, you give an example of something where a little bit of ambiguity might be helpful. Okay. So we went from, people in this specific situation where they struggle with substances, if they're given this clear, certain guidance, it's really helpful to them. But then when you talk about what happens when people are already in prison, the possibility of parole, you go before a parole board, you might get let go early, but there's no guarantees. And then you compare that to a fixed sentence where it's just you're in jail for 5 years or you're in prison for 5 years.
Yeah.
No chance of getting out. Okay. It's very interesting to me that in this case, the possibility of parole has very powerful effects on how people behave.
Yeah.
In prison.
And it's based on
not surprising, I should say, but still.
It winds up, it's based on the same idea. Basically, people are not thinking super far ahead. And so you really need to provide short-term incentives and consequences for good behavior. And so in this scenario, what happened is that, during the 90s, we started moving, a lot of states in the United States started moving toward what are called truth in sentencing policies. So it used to be that, you're sentenced to 4 years in prison, but you have the possibility of parole after 2 years if you really engage in rehabilitative programming and exhibit good behavior and all of that. And then at some point, people were like, wait, you said 4 years. Why is he out in 2? That's not fair. Both the left and right agreed that this was a terrible system. And so we reformed lots of states. This is something that we battle at AV, as there are a lot of states. They're still trying to implement truth in sentencing policies. And we've learned, it turns out they're really bad because they take away the incentive, the shorter run incentive to engage in rehabilitation when there isn't the possibility of an early release, right? So you would think you'd have plenty of incentive to invest in your own rehabilitation, because once you get out, you're going to want a job. You're going to want, to build your life. So you might as well start preparing for it now. But as we've been discussing, this is a group that is not very good at thinking very far ahead. And so providing the shorter term incentive that if you take that GED class and engage in substance use treatment and stay out of trouble, don't fight anybody, then you could get out 6 months earlier. That really works. And then the next question might be, well, okay, they're engaging in all this programming, but does it actually help? And the answer is yes. So we have these nice studies because we've tried these truth in sentencing policies in different places. Economists have been able to study the impacts of them. Basically, what you see is that once people no longer have the incentive to engage in this programming because they're not going to be able to get out earlier, they stop engaging in the programming. And then once they do get out, recidivism is higher. And so all that programming actually did seem to work. Or maybe it's just the having to practice being good worked. Yeah. Whatever it was, the incentive to be on good behavior and do the right thing was really effective. And when you take that away, that short run incentive away, then people don't do it anymore. And then when they do eventually get out, and most of these folks are going to get out eventually, we're all worse off.
The point about incentives is so powerful, and it is one of the single most economisty things about this approach. Yeah. I will say I get why people are queasy with the idea that a parole board of strangers gets to decide this. It's so much power over somebody's life to hand over to strangers. And depending on the specific group of strangers, some people are going to get a lenient board and say, yeah, great. Like you can get out now. Yeah. And some are going to get a harsher one. Like there's an arbitrariness to that, a randomness to that, I guess, that just feels wrong.
Yeah.
It feels off, you know?
Yeah.
And so there is a clear trade-off, I think, right? Because some people are going to get screwed in a situation like that.
Yes, but we do that already throughout the criminal justice system, right? We
Totally.
do it with the judges at the front end. We do it with the probation officers, the prosecutors. Like there's just randomness throughout the system. And that's just the consequence of something where it's not obvious what the right answer is. So we trust professionals to use their best judgment. Your best judgment might be different from my best judgment, and that's just natural. And that's where we kind of have to land. We have, in general, I think in this country, we swing back and forth between giving people more and less discretion, and we're constantly trying to battle this fundamental trade-off. But I mean, one thing that's really interesting to me about this conversation is that parole boards, I mean, the idea here is that people do change while they're locked up, and the parole boards have the opportunity to then respond to that. So the flip side of someone, being sentenced to 4 years with the possibility of parole after 2 is that you also have the possibility of staying 4, right? So if the parole board is seeing you're not doing so well and you're still fighting a lot of people and you're getting into a lot of trouble while you're incarcerated, they're not going to let you out after 2. They're going to keep you the full 4 because you're still a public safety threat. And that's a nice option to have. I think the other interesting aspect of this conversation is we could do much better job than we currently do of giving parole boards the information they need to make good decisions. Turns out right now, this is just not a policy area where we've invested a lot of time into thinking about how can we help them make really smart decisions. One group that they don't talk to very much just because of the way that the system's designed right now and the way information flows is the corrections officers who are in the facilities with everybody. They have a lot of information about who needs to be there and who doesn't. So, my team is thinking a bit about how can we facilitate the communication between corrections officers who are, doing the hard work of trying to keep everybody safe. They have a lot of information about these individuals. How do they get that information to the parole boards so that they can help keep the community safe?
We're deep into the book now and deep into the conversation. Now I'm going to bring up the thing that, if I'm not mistaken, might have given you the biggest headache of all these topics. I'm not totally sure, right? There might have been other headaches I'm not aware of.
Yeah.
All right. But the back and forth on the research about something called ban the box has been really, has been playing out publicly and quite heatedly for, I don't know, more than a decade now,
Yeah,
something
more
like
than
that.
a decade.
So let's set this up. Ban the box is a policy by which, I think it's state by state, if I'm not mistaken. So
sometimes cities even.
Sometimes cities. So if a state passes a ban the box policy, it means that employers are not allowed to ask prospective job seekers, people who want to work for their companies, whether or not they have a criminal record. That's the so-called box, right? So you ban the box. And the intention behind this policy seems like a good one, which is we want people who have gone through the prison system. We want them to be able to get back on their feet. We want them to have a second chance. We want them to get work. And if employers know that they have that criminal background, then they're going to be less likely to hire them. Right. And we want to take away that information essentially, right? And see if that helps.
Yep.
This has now been tried in many places. There have been many studies on this, including your own studies on this. Why don't we do this? Why don't you sort of take the listener through what's been found, and then we'll back up into like some of the specific back and forth and why this has been such a controversial topic.
Sure. So yeah, these policies are based on this very human impulse that like, gosh, we wish employers didn't care about the criminal record. We'll just tell them they can't ask, right? So that's kind of the
seems
basis.
Fair because these people
reasonable.
they've gone through the system, they've paid their dues.
We want people to have a second chance. We wish employers agreed with us, and maybe they even do, but they're trying to decide who to hire. And what the studies have found, the first question is just, does it actually help people with criminal records get a job? Seems like the answer there is, unfortunately, no. There are a couple of reasons that might be the case. One might be that it turns out doing a formal background check on someone, which under these policies you can eventually do. It's usually after you've made a conditional hiring decision. So employers get to eventually run someone's background check, but the idea is they've done an interview with the person already, gotten to know them a little bit. Maybe the person's explained their criminal record already to them. So they have a more complete picture. They have more information than they would have had otherwise. It could be that they just Google the person and see if they've got an arrest record online. A lot of this information is available for purchase. And so it could be that they get the information some other way. It could also be that they don't do that, but they go through the process. But then when they do run the background check, if you see they have a record, then they don't hire them. And then that feels especially bad because now you've just wasted this person's time. They've given them hope.
I mean, they've gotten a call back, they've gotten interviewed. You're saying sometimes it happens at the end of the process,
and then at the
not
very
at
end,
the
they're like,
right?
sorry, man, you've got a record. Like, I can't, this just isn't going to work out. And I've heard from folks who run nonprofits, this does happen a fair amount. And it's really dispiriting for people who are like, they'd rather just know up front. If you're not going to hire someone with a record, just tell me,
Right,
like, don't waste my time. So anyway, so we do have research now that's showing that's people aren't getting jobs. But then even more concerning, and this was what first really interested me about this policy, there's a real potential of unintended consequences here. So if employers care for whatever reason about whether someone has a criminal record, they don't want to hire someone with a criminal record, even if that feels really unfair, even if that for society makes it harder to reduce recidivism, et cetera, that is the concern the employer has and the incentive they're responding to. Now that they can't ask up front if you have a criminal record, they're in most cases going to try to guess. That's kind of going to be the human thing to do. They're not just going to say, well, gosh, I'll just treat everyone as equals. That's what we would love for them to do. But in reality, what we all do all day long is try to kind of make our best guess based on the information we still have. And in practice, because there are such large racial disparities in the United States between people who have records and people who don't, it turns out that employers will discriminate, especially on race. And young Black men without college degrees, the group that is most likely to be helped by this policy, if it works, because they're the group that's most likely to have a criminal record, actually we see employment for that group fall after Ban the Box goes into effect. So what seems to be happening now is that Ban the Box is making it harder for young Black men who do not have a criminal record to get a job interview and get a job, because employers are assuming they probably have a record, and then they just interview somebody else. And so we're not helping people with records. We're making it harder for a group of people who don't have records but have other challenges in the labor market, making it harder for them to find jobs. So on net, this is just a big mess.
It's interesting, and I want to make sure that we distinguish between two different things for the listener. One thing that also is pretty clear in the book is that there is a big race gap in terms of hiring, no matter what, right? It already exists.
Yes.
Ban the box, no ban the box. There already is there's racism in the labor market, right? That's there. One thing you've found, and at this point, there's just like an abundance of studies showing it, is that something like Ban the Box actually tends to increase the racial hiring gap. And this is, I guess economists refer to this as statistical discrimination,
right.
Where they take the sort of, okay, there's a higher share of Black men, let's say, who are convicted of crimes, higher share than white men. And so what they end up doing if they don't have the information is they end up discriminating, on the basis of like that context. Right. Statistical discrimination is something I'd been familiar with for a very long time, but I thought of it as a theory, and it was an interesting theory, but I was like, well, but this is something where you'd really want to test it in the real world to see if it actually is a thing. And the abundance of Ban the Box policies seem to kind of confirm that, like, companies do this.
Yeah.
It's a real thing.
Right. And people do it. I mean, I think this is I think the reason I think it's a really useful concept is if we're trying to reduce discrimination, you have to think about like, okay, what is the source of the discrimination to begin with? Like, what is the problem we're really trying to solve? And economists think of two types of discrimination. One is animus. It's just, I don't like people who've broken the law. There's nothing you can tell me about them. I just don't like rule breakers. That's just it. I don't want to associate with them. Statistical discrimination is about information. I'm really worried about whether someone is going to show up on time every day and stay out of trouble and be a good employee. That's really hard to observe from a job application or even a first interview. So I have to kind of go on other information that I can see that is correlated with those things I actually care about. So I don't actually care about the criminal record, but I view a criminal record as basically a negative credential that I have reason to believe is associated with these other bad things I'm trying to avoid. And so what's nice about statistical discrimination is if we want to reduce it, if we're able to give people more information about the stuff they actually care about, they'll rely on that thing they were using as a proxy less. And so that's true for the criminal record. It's true for race. So there's other previous evidence that even just making it easier to check people's backgrounds when, like, the internet became a thing in the 90s, it wasn't always easy to check someone's criminal record, right, as a job, as an employer. Once it became easier, you saw that the racial gap in hiring fell dramatically. So it seems like what people were doing, employers were doing, was using race as a proxy for whether someone had a criminal record. Once they were actually able to just check the criminal record, they didn't care about race anymore. I mean, obviously, still,
they
lots
did.
of people do care about race. They cared less
Right.
about race than they did before.
Sure.
And so it was actually adding the box was actually a solution or partial solution to that earlier problem. So taking it away brought us back. It was a step backward.
That seems the lesson of this chapter, which is add information, don't take it away.
That's my main takeaway from a lot of this. And we see this in other spaces too. There's interesting research around drug testing. There are a lot of reasons people don't like that letting employers do drug tests of employees. Turns out when you don't let them do that, they try to guess who might be using, and then you see increases in racial gaps in hiring. Same thing for credit check bans. On average, people who are Black have lower credit scores. So there's a lot of concern that allowing employers to check someone's credit score before hiring them is adding to these racial gaps in employment. It turns out that when you ban the credit check, that actually increases the racial gap. It's the other way around. It's because employers, again, are going to use race as a proxy when they can't ask. So in general, I think the lesson here is the way information flows in these types of hiring decisions is just really important, and information is really valuable. And we should always be erring toward more information rather than less. And I'm sure there are examples where that's, not going to move us in the right direction, but I think it's a good general rule of thumb. And in this particular context, it's just super important.
Yeah, there's an anecdote in the book about when you went to present to Congress on these findings.
Mm-hmm.
And you said something that, like, you brought studies to a knife fight or something like that, or like this is something that you concluded later as you were reflecting on it, because you showed these studies showing it worked a certain way.
Yeah.
But one of the other guests who disagreed with you, one of the other people who were testifying to Congress, started calling you all kinds of names and saying you don't have any context for this. You're trying to destroy people who, have gone through the prison system already, stuff like that. It's kind of interesting to me that this seems to have become quite personal.
Yeah.
That this one did not stay in the we disagree on like the methodology of how to conduct the studies and things like that. This one became something bigger than that.
Yeah. Yeah. This study, I think, was the first one I wrote that actually really put me into these policy conversations. And it turns out that the policy/political conversation is often very different from the conversation you have at an academic seminar. And so it was just, the goal was just to win the fight however you could. And I think about this policy area a lot because I think it was a space where a lot of economists especially were very concerned about this policy when we first heard about it. It's like, this could really backfire, but we're researchers. And so, that's a theory. Don't want to go out there and say we shouldn't do it because it might do this. We want to wait for the evidence. And, there are other reasonable people who think it's going to help. So who are we to say, But then by the time the research was actually written, there was a really established ban the box lobby that still exists, that's still out there passing these laws, right? And at that point, you have a lot of people whose careers depend on these policies being passed, not on solving the problem, but on the specific policy solution. And that was then a very difficult thing to be fighting, right? And so it just, as someone who cares a lot about policy and thinks a lot even more directly about policy now than I did when I was writing the study, it becomes a tricky balance between thinking about like when you feel like you know enough to raise some red flags. And there is a real risk to, if you wait too long, it's not just that there are some people whose lives could be harmed. Like that's all, in general, we're always trying stuff that may or may not work. But it's really the political aspect of having these lobbies that emerge whose livelihoods depend on not changing their mind, basically. And that, I don't know the answer to that one, but it's a real struggle.
One example of information, of adding information that does seem to work is if somebody coming out of prison has a kind of credential that shows that they have done work either in prison or something like that, that like, it's almost like proof of concept. Like, yes, I'm going to tell you, I'm going to be transparent with you that I have been convicted of a crime in the past, but towards the end of my time in prison, I also like completed this program and here's a credential from a judge. That does seem pretty powerful. That does seem to work. Did I read that right?
Yeah. So these, they go by different names in different places, but rehabilitation certificates or employability certificates. Basically, if you go in, you can go to a judge and kind of say, look, I've done all this work. And try to convince them I've been rehabilitated. And they can give you this certificate that then you can take to an employer. And there have been these nice studies, just like the studies showing that employers do routinely discriminate against people with criminal records. It turns out that if you have the criminal record plus the certificate, basically completely wipes out the effect of the criminal record. You're called back at equal rates to someone who had no record at all when the person with the record, but no certificate is still struggling. And so this policy seems to be doing what Ban the Box was hoping to do, right? Get the person's foot in the door. These studies are all looking at callbacks so far. We're hoping there'll be some studies of these policies are now
people actually getting hired.
Actually see if people get hired, actually see what happens to recidivism, things like that. But at least this first stage, we're seeing that people are getting their foot in the door and having a chance to compete, which is great.
I want to do a bit of a lightning round on a couple of things. Okay. Something like that might help people get a job. Ultimately, you're studying it, right? But it seems promising.
Yeah.
Turns out having a job itself, though,
yeah,
not necessarily as effective as you'd hope at reducing recidivism. So people still seem to commit crimes at similar rates, whether they have a job or not after they get out of prison.
Yeah.
Borderline shocking to me. I didn't know that. And I thought I'd been following your work pretty closely, but when I came across that in the book, I was like, well, that number one sucks.
Yeah.
And number two, I was surprised by that.
I think most economists are surprised by this. And it's taken a long time for those of us in this field to be like, yeah, I think this is actually where we are. This is unfortunate. And I think the way I think about it at this point is a job is probably necessary, but not sufficient. Like it's hard to imagine being able to build a stable, crime-free life without a job. So you probably do need a job. But the source of this conclusion is, we've got some nice randomized trials of like transitional jobs programs where someone gets a job for 6 months. The hope is to help them learn some job skills, get a reference.
Some money in their pocket.
Money in the pocket. Yeah. So we see, those people do show up, they work during this period. And then once the 6 months ends, they're right back down with the control group in terms of whether or not they have a job. So that doesn't actually work at transitioning them into the labor market. And while they're engaged in the transitional job, they're actually not any less likely to reoffend. Maybe if the studies found any effect, it's super small. And so that's super disappointing because it does feel like there's one theory here that if you have to show up at 9 a.m. every morning to work, you're not going to be out late. You're not going to be causing trouble with your friends. You're now surrounded by a whole bunch of other people who are also trying to change their lives and are hardworking. That should be a good influence, right? And there are a bunch of reasons to think, plus the money issue, like that this should be helpful and keep you out of trouble. And it doesn't. But then we do have other studies showing like if you happen to get lucky and get released from prison during a really hot labor market in your county, there's a housing boom and everyone's hiring for construction workers or something, then you are less likely to reoffend. And so it's like, okay, so jobs are helpful there, but if we just give you a job, it's not helpful. And so it's a bit of a puzzle. But
it's like economic conditions which are associated with more jobs. Those are helpful, but not necessarily just having a job in isolation.
So for the longest time, I did wonder if it's like, maybe it's the friends and family of the person who's released from prison who are better off, like during the hot job market, but regardless, we have not figured out, there isn't real clear evidence at this point that like giving someone a job is actually useful at reducing recidivism, which then puts me in the place thinking maybe I just, I haven't completely given up on the idea that a job is necessary, but not sufficient. And that's the not sufficient piece. So it's like, there's still other stuff that's a problem. And maybe it's mental health issues. Maybe it's substance use. Maybe it's not having the network to be able to find a job. I don't know. Yeah. But there's clearly other stuff.
Quality of the job or something like in a hot labor market, the jobs
pay well,
pay more, higher raises, better benefits, better, more flexibility, stuff like that. And we don't have a lot of hot labor markets to pull from in the last quarter century.
Right.
Really.
And that's really hard for, going and telling a policymaker, if you could just make your local labor market really hot, that would be very helpful. And they're like, please get out of my office.
Please leave. Thanks. We have to hope.
We thought about that. Yeah.
We have to hope that the Federal Reserve does its job. Oh, you're telling me a good economy is good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow.
Yes.
Amazing. I didn't
Insight
have a
from the
20. Yeah,
economist.
I didn't have a 21-year-old junior staffer intern who could tell me that. Right.
That's right.
A few things I'm just going to mention, and I will essentially tease the book if people want the details of it, because I
Great.
have something important to ask you about
Mhm.
as we close. Right. Something else that seems not to work, something called wraparound services, which is
Yeah.
essentially like a flood the zone thing where somebody gets out of prison and you offer them almost everything, like
Mhm.
counseling, mental health
Yeah.
services,
Job training, all the
like the
things.
whole thing
Mhm.
doesn't work.
Yep.
What does seem to work, giving people money,
Yep.
especially right after they get out of prison so they don't get desperate. That does seem quite promising, right? I don't
Yep.
know how
Or
definitive
at
the
like
evidence
key
is on that.
moments where they're like, at risk of becoming homeless or something.
Right.
It's like, great, let's pay your rent for the month. So, and then you're less likely to be arrested.
Right.
Yep.
Don't cut people off from Medicaid or
Yeah.
healthcare generally.
Mental health care is something I
matters
think
a lot.
a lot about right now. Yep.
That's helpful for people. It's also helpful, by the way, for like their kids,
Yep.
and the likelihood that like the children of people who commit crimes will themselves grow up to commit crime, that kind of thing.
That's public benefits
You
in
know.
general. It's like thinking about like SNAP benefits and stuff like that. Nutrition for young kids turns out really protective for lots of different reasons that we could have a longer conversation about. Yeah.
Big section that, again, I'm going to leave as an incentive for people to buy the book, which they absolutely have to. Big section on how to help kids and then also teens and young adults, which I thought was really powerful as well.
There is this punchline like, helping people change their trajectory they're on and pulling people out of the system is not impossible. I hope that is a takeaway from the book. There's a lot we could be doing to change them, to put someone on a better path. But man, is it much easier if we stop them from ever being pulled into the system to begin with.
In the first
So
place.
doing some of that preventive stuff for kids and young adults would be a really beneficial policy move.
I was thinking throughout the book, what are some of the through lines besides helping people get a second chance at life? The truth is that your approach is not one that lends itself to through lines. It's very, I think you refer to it as an incremental approach. Like do these studies, see what works, and then put in place policies that are consistent with the data. But it's not like this overarching philosophy. It's not this big structural theory for how to do criminal justice better or anything like that. And I guess what I'm wondering is, again, does that make your job harder as a salesperson for this? You see what I mean?
Yeah.
Like it's easy to have a slogan. It's easy to be like, this is the thing that we can always, this is our North Star. You don't really have one of those. Essentially, your theory is like, there's all this data we have. And yeah, one thing in isolation, one new policy in isolation may not make a huge difference. And by the way, it may not. Except for the people specifically affected, but societally it may not. But if you do all these things at once, that would have a big effect, right?
Well, and some of these small incremental changes we discussed before, like the erring toward leniency for first-time offenders, 50% reduction in recidivism is not a tiny change, right? And so some of these small changes do have big effects. But yeah, I guess I think of the overarching theme here as being we should be approaching this policy space and really all policy spaces with more of a scientific mindset and a scientific approach rather than with the kind of big idea about what is going to be effective. So thinking of everything as being a process of trial and error and focusing on, getting really clear on what is the outcome we're actually trying to change, what does success look like, and keeping our eye on that ball. Like our goal is to solve the problem. Our goal is not our preferred policy solution, right? And so really just shifting everything to thinking about how can we have to go out and just try stuff. I think a lot of people hear me talk about things about, whether or not something's evidence-based and they say, I just want to slow us down. They're just that I'm just trying to like put sand in the gears or whatever and slow the process of moving forward. And my response is always like, the only way we're going to learn what works is if we try stuff. We have to be going out there and trying stuff, but we have to do it in a way where we stay humble. We're not wed. We don't become wed to solutions until we know if they're effective. And we're implementing things in a way that we can actually learn from. And that's not impossible. I think also a lot of people just don't know about how economists think about studying the impacts of things, that there are these natural experiments we can use. We don't have to just be running randomized trials. And so there is a way that we can be learning as we go. And it's really we have to learn as we go approach that I think is the new lens, the different worldview, I guess I'm trying to bring to the conversation.
What have you learned about persuasion in doing this work?
I have a colleague of mine, Kevin Ring, who leads our criminal justice advocacy team, is constantly reminding me that lawmakers do not care about research. And so
That's a bummer. Thanks. I just spent 2 decades doing research, so really appreciate it.
Thank you,
Kevin. Appreciate that.
So we have a nice agreement that it's like, okay, as long as anything, I get to sign off on something as evidence-based, and you sell it however you have to sell it, as long as you don't cite bad studies, right? If you're going to cite a study, at least cite a good one. But yeah, so stories, individual people's. There's so much of policymaking is about individual relationships, just getting to know and trust people in terms of lawmakers, in terms of advocates. And so really the other line I have learned from my colleague Kevin is that you learn from people you love. And so just really trying to get to know individuals and see them as people that share your concerns and goals is very helpful. It's probably not surprising to any of the other social scientists out there, but the economists are like, this is fascinating. It's also interesting because I've realized it's the same issue on the research side that we're really trying to solve. It's like, if we want more and better research, if we want people to go out there, researchers and practitioners to work together to study the impact of some new policy. And, my policy colleagues will say, well, why aren't these studies being done? Maybe the researchers don't know that's an interesting question. It's like, yes, of course they know, but they're trying to cold call the police departments and no one's returning their calls. If we actually introduced these people, right, and they got to know each other and trust each other a bit, then they might want to work together. So it just turns out that so many of the problems we're trying to solve, all the way from research to policy to implementation, are just very human problems where we just need everyone interacting in the real world, which is fun, which means we get to just throw some parties and make sure everybody gets to meet each other.
Perfect place to close. Jen, your book is available for pre-order everywhere. Mm-hmm. You do these things, right?
Yes.
Who's the publisher?
Holt Macmillan.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so go to the Holt Macmillan site, or go to Amazon, or go to Barnes & Noble, or wherever you want. Go to your indie local bookstore.
Yes,
whatever.
That would be fantastic.
Yeah, go order it. It's fantastic. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you, Cardiff. I really appreciate it.
And that's our show for today. You can find a link to pre-order The Science of Second Chances in the show notes for this episode. Trust me, you'll be glad you did. The New Bazaar is a production of the Economic Innovation Group. Adrian Lilly is our sound engineer, and our music is by Scott Lane and DJ Harrison of Subfloor Studio. Special thanks to Ruben Francis and Stephen Leverton for production assistance. Please follow or subscribe to The New Bazaar on your app of choice. And if you enjoyed today's show, please leave us a review or tell a friend. If you want to get in touch, I'm on Twitter as @Cardiff Garcia, or you can email us at thenewbazaar@eig.org. See you next episode.